In this section, we're going to have a look at lifestyle and health in England from 1250 to 1500. But to give you an idea about why this is important, we're going to take a look at some population figures. Because in the year 1300, historians estimate that there were 4.75 million people living in England. Now by 1450, the estimate is that there were 2 million people living in England. These are really rough guesses because people at the time didn't keep very good records, but it does appear that over the course of 150 years, the number of people in the country had more than halved. So clearly issues around health and longevity were making a really big impact. Now we'll start off by looking at the society of the time. There's a king. There's always a king between 1250 and 1500, no queens I'm afraid. And he was the most powerful person in the country. He was actually believed to have been appointed by God because God was all powerful. There was no way anyone could become king without God's permission. And the role of the king was really to protect the country from threats inside or outside of it. It was to maintain something called the king's peace. This is basically the right of his subjects to get on with their lives without any kind of interference from ill-intentioned people. And a good king even, was supposed to encourage trade as well. But that's pretty much it. Kings do collect taxes and take money from people, but really that's just to fund their own lifestyle. They don't put it back into the country. They don't use it to make things clean and nice, or to build good roads, or to put up impressive buildings. There are really no public services coming from the government of England at this time at all. The other thing to say about kings is that some of them are very good and keep very good control over people and work very hard for the country. Some of them don't. And when you have a bad or a weak king, what quite often happens is that they lose control and people get really fed up of them, and they might raise an army to try and get rid of them. So a bad king can lead to wars, and they might create problems. Another group in medieval England are what we would call the lords. And these are basically rich and important people. Now the richest and the most important are called barons. And they owned massive swathes of land, and they had their own private armies. Now commonly what would happen is that they would give chunks of that land out to soldiers called knights in return for the knights fighting for them. And the knights would then have control of that chunk of land and the people who lived in it. So they became known as lords of the manor. By the end of the 1200s, the lords have won the right to sit on Parliament. And that gives them the right to control a little bit of how many taxes the king can charge. But the lords don't really have all that much control over the king. They do obviously have quite a lot of control over the people underneath them. And those are what we commonly call the peasants. Now, this is the most important group when we're looking at health, really, because it's the biggest and it's the most representative. It's also the one that we know the least about, purely because nobody really bothered to write down what their lives were like. We do know that most of them, most of the ordinary people and the workers in the country, lived in the countryside. They were rural. And they worked on the land growing food, so they were farmers. And very often the lord of the manor would give a peasant a strip of land to support themselves on in return for the peasant working on the lord's land. So that was how that system worked. There is some evidence that people in medieval times weren't necessarily as unhealthy as we might assume that they were. So if we have a look at adult male height, this is a good way it's one way of trying to work out how healthy people were, and it works on the assumption that if you are well nutritioned and you're healthy, you grow taller. So if we look at average male adult height, The average male adult height in medieval times in England was 5'8". And that's really quite tall. If we compare it to the modern day, the height of the average modern day male adult is 5'10". So they're only really, nowadays, we're only a little bit taller than people were back then. And certainly if we compare it to the Victorians, their average male adult height was only 5'4". So it would seem that people in medieval times, from that point of view, were really quite healthy. Let's squeeze it on there. It also, when we look at their diet also suggests that they ate quite a balanced and quite a healthy diet as well. If they had a cow, or perhaps a sheep or a goat, they would be able to access dairy and have milk and cheese and butter. They could grow vegetables and perhaps fruit in their garden. Not potatoes, because they hadn't been discovered yet. Apparently people ate a lot of parsnips instead. So I've drawn a parsnip. They would also sometimes have meat and fish and chicken, poultry. It wasn't very common for ordinary people in medieval times to have fresh meat. Because they didn't have fridges, they would usually smoke it to try and make it last longer. They pickled a lot of foods as well. If they could find them, then they might have berries and nuts and honey from the forest, things they found when they were foraging. They could eat things like rabbits, but there were very, very harsh penalties for poaching, so they had to be careful about hunting on what might be somebody else's land. The main staple of the medieval diet, though, was bread. And it's estimated that the average medieval person ate 2 to 3 pounds of bread a day. Now, I have a loaf of bread that I've just weighed to find out how much that is. My loaf of bread was less than £1. So we're maybe looking at 3 or 4 loaves of bread per day. Richer people would eat bread that was made out of wheat. Poorer people would eat bread that was made out of a different grain called rye, and that was a bit darker, seen as a bit less desirable. It was quite common for people who were rich or poor in medieval England to eat something called pottage, which was a kind of stew made out of vegetables and meat if they had it, and maybe bran. If they added some kind of cereal or grain to it, then it was called frumenty. In terms of drinks, people didn't drink water very much for reasons that we'll go into later. But they did have a variety of other options. So one thing that people used to drink was a kind of very weak beer that was brewed out of barley that was called small ale. And there was just enough alcohol in it to stop it going bad. And also because it was boiled, that killed a lot of the germs that might be in it. They could also drink cider made out of apples, and there was a kind of much stronger alcoholic drink called mead that was made out of honey. So those were the options for the drink. On the whole, it was potentially quite a well-balanced and quite a healthy diet. And one thing that archaeologists have noticed about medieval skeletons when they've dug them up is that they tended to have very, very good teeth because they didn't have very much sugar in their diet. In terms of where they lived, I've got a house up here. There's our medieval peasant with his family this time. Houses may have looked something like this. They would be built out of timber, with a timber frame and perhaps hardened mud as the wall. Some of them were just built entirely out of timber. The roof would be made out of mud. The roof would be made out of straw woven together. That's called a thatched roof. There wouldn't be a chimney, instead there would be a hole for smoke from the fire to escape. And windows would just be a hole in the wall, perhaps with wooden shutters. They didn't have glass. But they did have windows. And for drinking, people usually, or for water, people would rely on the nearest river or stream or spring. Some people had wells, but those wells would be filled by the nearest river or stream or spring, so it tended to be the same water. And they would use that for washing. Sometimes people drowned doing that. And for cooking. And perhaps for drinking as well. So if medieval people had potentially a healthy lifestyle, why did the population drop so dramatically over the course of the 13 and the 1400s?